Genesis. In the beginning, God created the universe. The earth was formless and desolate. The beginning of everything is a fantastic and awesome subject to contemplate, and there is no one answer in visual terms. I am Brian J. Turner, an artist, and this opening line from the first book of the Bible grabbed my imagination and inspired this painting, Genesis, the first in my Bible project, which will see me paint my way through the entire Bible over the next 20 years and will contain an estimated 2,000 paintings. My painting deals with the creation narrative in abstract terms. I did not want to repeat what had gone before, and for me, I felt the only way that that very moment creation could be portrayed was by an abstract painting. Primarily, an abstract painting deals with shape, colour and form, and this is exactly how I saw the creation. That is why there are no animals, fish, plants, trees, etc. in my painting, because when I read the creation narrative, I imagine the shapes and colours that might have existed at the very beginning of the world, and from which everything that exists might have been formed. Trying to imagine the very beginning of everything, I pondered, was there simply shape and colour with very little form? Did form arrive out of the fusion of shape and colour, the abstract giving way to the figurative? The shapes you see are what I imagine the colliding forces of everything forming might look like at the very beginning. My painting is an attempt to gather all the elements, darkness, light, sun and moon, sky and land, earth and sea, etc., and combine them in such a way as to make sense of it all, whilst recognising that none of us really know what happened. The first covenant, God and Noah. This painting deals with the narrative of Noah and the flood, but at a specific point where God says to Noah, "As a sign of this everlasting covenant which I am making with you and with all living beings, I am putting my bow in the clouds. It will be a sign of my covenant with the world." The rainbow is a gift from God, and I wanted to interpret it as a physically wrapped up gift that when opened would portray a sense of wonder and surprise, especially as no one had seen a rainbow before. When thinking about how God might present a gift to Noah, I decided on a long box, big enough to contain the rainbow, taking inspiration from an old easel box discarded in my studio. The rainbow is wrapped, so that when opened the light would burst out as the gift is revealed, and when it is, Noah is both surprised and delighted. In my Bible project, which can be viewed online at www.bibleproject.co.uk, I like to imagine and visualise the narrative of the Bible in a modern and inspiring way, whilst retaining the original meaning of the text itself. Painting allows me the opportunity to consider various ideas and options to portray the narrative of the Bible, and whilst it might be physically impossible to contain the rainbow, I enjoy the fact that in my painting it is boxed and presented as a gift.
Hello, welcome to the Art of Bible Reading, a narrative approach. In this film, we're going to introduce you to our narrative approach to religious education in schools. It's an approach we have created as part of a curriculum development project based at the University of Exeter and funded by Bible Society, England and Wales. During the course of the film, we'll be telling you about the origins of our project and the classroom problems it sought to solve. We'll talk about the theories underpinning our approach and provide you with examples of how we've implemented them in practice. And we'll explain how we brought our approach to life using the paintings of Devon-based artist Brian J. Turner. Now and again, he'll be joining us to talk about his Bible project and introduce us to some of the paintings we've used in our curriculum resources. Our approach has been developed primarily for use in multi-faith religious education in schools without a religious affiliation, but it can be applied in the context of many different forms of religious education, mono or multi-faith, and many different types of school those with and without a religious character. The principles and practices we endorse are transferable to many different settings. Indeed, the range of teachers and schools showing an interest in our approach shows its versatility. In developing our approach, our overriding concern has been to ensure that religious education does justice to the faith traditions that are taught. To accomplish this, we have sought to breathe new life into the disciplinary link between theology and religious education. For this reason, our project team consists of theologians and educational researchers. More specifically, we believe that narrative theories and narrative theologies can make a significant contribution to improving the quality of religious education. We think that a narrative approach can portray each faith in ways that reflect its distinctiveness and internal diversity, and in ways that are authentic to the lives and experiences of members of the faith community. This approach contrasts with the ways religious education is usually thought about and taught in many schools. In religious education in England, so-called phenomenological approaches have been dominant for many years. Phenomenological religious education attempts to be objective, descriptive, and non-evaluative, often studying similar phenomena as they appear in different religions. However, such approaches often assumes there exists a neutral standpoint lying outside any particular faith commitment from which all religions might be surveyed. We don't believe that's true. Everybody approaches the study of religion from a particular point of view, reflecting their own life stories and their fundamental assumptions about the world and religions within it. Phenomenological approaches often assume that all religions share a common essence, that which is central to the inner experiences of all religious believers, regardless of what faith tradition they uphold. Sometimes this leads religious education teachers to present all religions as essentially true. However, such a belief challenges the distinctiveness and integrity of the different faith traditions, potentially leading to the trivializing and relativizing of deeply held religious convictions. Phenomenological approaches also run the risk of employing a new form of confessionalism, based not in religion, but upon liberal and secular ideologies. Recently, there have been attempts to move away from phenomenological approaches, but these have come under criticism themselves. For example, critical pedagogical approaches, often centering on comparing and contrasting beliefs, have been criticized for creating simplistic and uncomplicated caricatures of religions. They tend to reduce religious faith to mere assent to doctrinal propositions, ignoring the complexities, subtleties, and nuances of the lived realities of faith. Another example would be the kind of approach that sees religion as the personal construction of each adherent and focuses on the small narratives of students rather than the grand narratives of the world's religions. Such approaches have been criticized for promoting the idea that there's no objective reality, removing any criteria by which teachers and students might critically evaluate sources of evidence and personal narratives, and denying children the opportunity to tackle wider issues such as debates about cultures and how they're formed. The problems with existing approaches are not merely matters of theoretical concern. They matter because religions and the relations between them matter. This is most evident in recent global politics, where religions are often portrayed as a cause of violent conflict. In response, policy imperatives within religious education often require the subject to fulfill a role in promoting social cohesion. However, If religious education fails to do justice to each individual faith tradition as lived and experienced by believers, then it cannot hope to deal effectively with matters concerning the relations between the faiths, especially those that result in conflict or violence. We believe the use of narrative theories and related narrative theologies can improve the handling of complex and sensitive topics within religious education. A narrative approach can help teachers navigate intricate and often delicate matters pertaining to the lived experiences of and relations within and between the faiths. Furthermore, it's an approach that's related to and rooted in an understanding of faith that is shared by the faith traditions themselves. So although our project and this film are focused on the study of Christianity, we think our narrative approach has the potential to be applied not just to the study of the three Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity and Islam, but also to the study of all faith traditions within religious education.
Turning water into wine. When I start to think about a new painting, I begin with the text, looking for ways to represent the narrative in either its own time or bringing it into a contemporary setting. Not all narratives lend themselves to a modern interpretation, and turning water into wine is one example where I could use a contemporary setting, placing Jesus in it as if he were here today. Common elements are used, such as water being turned into wine, and something apparently miraculous happens in an ordinary setting, but with a twist. There is only one person present, rather than a whole party of people. The wine is coming out of the taps, and rather than being stored in jars, is being put into bottles. By focusing on the act of the miracle itself, I became interested in putting Jesus in a contemporary setting, but one that was personal to me, hence my kitchen. I asked the question, what if Jesus were at a dinner party at my house and the wine had run out? How would he replenish it? The answer to me was quite simple. Jesus would go to my sink, turn on the taps and bottle the wine. And so the painting was born. I could imagine hearing a chuckle from Jesus as, bottle in hand, he turned on the taps at my kitchen sink and quite simply turned water into wine.
A Jim Sizemore cartoon shows bride and groom at the altar. And do you, Kathy, promise to advance Ed's narrative, reads the caption. Many of us think of life as a story with a beginning and an end, but it's unusual to talk quite so directly about one's experience as a narrative. That's why the cartoon is funny. Drawing on the work of narrative philosophers such as Paul Ricoeur and Alistair MacIntyre, and narrative theologians such as Stanley Hauerwas and Gerard Loughlin, our approach to RE in the classroom accepts that everyone has a story. Human life may be described as a narrative journey. At the most personal level, it's through narrative that we become aware of our own identity. We understand our lives in story form. Our lives are histories of experience that happen over time. Narrative is needed to answer the question, who am I? Am I the self-same person that I was 20 years ago? I don't look the same, and probably no cell in my body is the same. Yet I am the self-same person in difference. Narrative is needed to account for our perception of ourselves as more than merely a succession of isolated momentary occurrences. We might not always like to recount every aspect of our narrative. So what you're telling me, says the female interviewer in this cartoon, is that you've been fired from the last 15 jobs you've had. Why isn't that on your resume? I felt it might disrupt the narrative flow, he replies. Even if it pains us to remember all the story of our lives, storytelling is part of the process of meaning-making, of creating order out of chaos, of exploring and articulating our own intuitive knowledge. Narrative is also needed to answer the question, who are we? Like individuals, communities and peoples are also formed by living together within stories. Narratives form communities. Post-apartheid South Africa continues to challenge conceptions from the colonial era, to recount the overcoming of apartheid and to write a new future for the nation. An ongoing story of change and growth, challenges and possibilities is in process. Football clubs in major cities, rugby clubs, schools, families, business corporations, even nation states have stories and traditions. Each has a history, familiar practices, hopes and dreams, etc. Each has a narrative identity of some kind, or indeed multiple identities, as told by cultural, ethnic and socio-economic groups in diversity. Similarly, the idea of narrative identity helps us make sense of the lived experience of faith communities and traditions. All the major world religions may be understood as living stories or traditions, comprising beliefs, text and practices passed down through the generations and continually reinvented by the adherents of today. All are likely to be characterized by diversity and change, as well as continuity and sameness. Of interest to RE are the ways in which faith communities tell stories of their beliefs to themselves and to others. Our work is committed to respecting the lived experiences, traditions and histories, that is, the narratives of faith communities, historically and in the present day. Religion is perceived first and foremost not as a matter of edicts or commands, but of shared stories and worldviews held in common. Christianity, Judaism and Islam are lived narratives of faith. What does this emphasis on narrative then mean for the teaching of RE? In Christianity, we suggest that it means at least three things. Firstly, the Bible is perceived not as a collection of doctrinal or moral principles, but rather as a set of stories that together tell the bigger story of the revelation of God through history and of God's redemptive love for humankind. As Cambridge theologian David Ford puts it, understanding the nature of Christian salvation is inseparable from telling the particular story. For revelation is the word made flesh, the story made concrete and personal in Christ Jesus. It's not enough to teach the Bible merely by searching it for isolated moral principles, as might be found in the parable of the Good Samaritan, for instance. While the Bible comprises literary genres that include parables, poetry, law codes and commandments, all are part of that Scripture's overarching narrative. The meanings of each part are only properly grasped when interpreted within the Bible story as a whole. This work of interpretation of the Bible story as a whole means that ethics in the RE classroom can no longer be construed primarily upon neo-Kantian lines as the generation of rationalist rules or abstract moral principles. Rather, ethics in faith traditions is concerned with encounters between individuals, communities and peoples and the God they confess. A narrative approach to ethics in the RE classroom emphasises secondarily the importance of the imagination and empathy as pupils are asked temporarily to suspend disbelief and walk in another's shoes, viewing the world from another's perspective. Viewing the Christian faith from the inside in this sense, pupils are enabled to glimpse something of what it means to live as part of a community that adopts a particular worldview and is shaped by certain narratives. Significantly, this approach allows pupils to engage in critical interpretation even from an early age. Is this mushroom-shaped blob in the cartoon a bomb or a tree? Does this text from the Bible justify violence against others, or should it be read differently? Thirdly, a narrative approach to ethics in the RE classroom is relational. My story is bound up with yours. Individuals are variously members of differing, interacting and conjoining stories. At the most general, we are all part of the story of humanity on this fragile planet. Pupils are encouraged to reflect upon the narrative identities of the faith communities discussed in a way that allows them to perceive themselves and others as interpreters, perhaps as part of, but certainly in relation to the narratives discussed. So, drawing on the philosophy of Paul Ricoeur and others, we suppose a narrative conception of the self and also of communities and societies. This narrative conception of communities, formed from the multiple, overlapping and at times contradictory and problematic stories of the people of which it comprises, is the narrative philosophy that supports our teaching of RE. It's universal enough in scope and application for the teaching of major faith traditions in RE, and we suggest is a way of expressing how members of faith traditions experience their faith. A narrative understanding of the lived faith experience is consonant with Christian identity and the practice of faith day by day. To summarise, informed by this narrative philosophy of self-identity and also the narrative theologies that reflect Jewish, Christian and Muslim self-telling of their faith, we use the concept of narrative in the classroom to give pupils permission to reflect upon their own narrative identities, to open possibilities of interpretation that enable pupils to situate themselves as part of many and diverse worldviews, and to situate themselves in relation to narratives that they may or may not share.
Cutting the cake, the nativity painting. One of the most exciting things about my Bible project is that I get the chance to paint biblical narrative in entirely new ways, and cutting the cake, the nativity painting, is a good example. I was looking for a way to explore the nativity, but didn't want to paint the usual images of a stable, baby Jesus, 3 wise men, the shepherds, a star, etc., etc. For many years I struggled with the narrative, looking for inspiration, and one year at a Christmas service at my local church I found the answer. My vicar had provided a cake and declared to the congregation that, as it was Jesus' birthday, we would all celebrate by having a slice of birthday cake. I realised that this was exactly the idea I had been looking for, and on leaving the church I thanked him for giving me inspiration for a painterly interpretation of the Nativity that, to my knowledge, had not existed before. Cutting the cake, the Nativity painting, therefore has a birthday cake as a central theme, with 3 candles as a symbol of the Trinity. Jesus is cutting the cake, and 2 disciples seem distracted by the billowing curtains. Inspiration for paintings can come from many and varied sources, and my nativity painting shows that if one remains open to sources of inspiration, then answers can be found to the most intriguing of painterly problems.
We have drawn together all these ideas in a unit of work that shows how a narrative approach to theological inquiry can work in the RE classroom. Focusing just on narratives from the Bible, we have devised 12 lessons that take students through the overarching story of creation, fall and salvation that is central to the Christian faith. Each lesson is based around 4 phases of learning that together make up our narrative approach. Our first phase of learning introduces students to a particular biblical narrative. They may read the Bible text for themselves or listen to it being read by others. Students are encouraged to ask, what is going on in the story? And to think about the key conventions of storytelling, character, setting, and plot. All students, regardless of whether or not they have prior knowledge or understanding of stories from the Bible, can engage with the text in this way. As well as reading or hearing the text, students are also introduced to Brian J. Turner's painting of the biblical narrative. The painting provides a point of focus and helps to bring the story to life. Through asking further questions, students are invited to think about how Turner has chosen to show the story in his painting. For example, this is Turner's painting of the Nativity. In a lesson focusing on the Nativity narrative, students would be encouraged to look closely at the painting and to read the biblical text from the Gospel of Matthew. Questions they might be prompted to ask could include, why does the angel tell Joseph to name the baby Jesus? Who do you think the three figures in the painting might be? And what do you think the cake in the painting might symbolise? The aim of this phase is to facilitate a meeting of the student's own life story, his or her narrative self, whether Christian or not, with an aspect of the Christian faith, that is, the narrative of the text. At this stage, pupils do not need to reflect on how they see their relationship with the text. Rather, they are simply becoming acquainted with it. Our second phase of learning introduces students to the idea that narratives or stories can be interpreted in different ways. Turner's paintings tend to show challenging rather than literal representations of the texts, and students are now encouraged to see them as Turner's own personal readings of the biblical narratives. Listening to talking head audio clips of Turner discussing his paintings, students are invited to think about how Turner's own life experiences have influenced his Bible paintings and how his individual life story impacts upon his relationship with the texts. They are asked to consider the symbolism used in the paintings and to think about how this enables Turner to convey his own readings of the narratives. Students are also given the opportunity to respond to and critique Turner's visual interpretations of the texts. Studying dialogues between people who hold contrasting views, for example, a conversation between fictional groups of art critics or students about one of Turner's paintings, they are invited to discuss these opinions and to contribute thoughts of their own. For example, a lesson focusing on Turner's Nativity painting might feature the following conversation between a group of students. Katie: I don't see what this painting has to do with the Nativity narrative. It's nothing like the Nativity play we did at primary school. Thomas: but there are three people. Maybe they're the wise men from the Nativity narrative. Jamie: no, I think there are other people in the narrative. Maybe Mary, Joseph and Jesus grown up. Anna: I think the painting helps to show how Jesus being born fits in with other beliefs Christians have. At my church, we pray to God the Father, Son and Holy Spirit. Maybe the three people represent God. Safia: the Nativity narrative is about when Jesus was born. I think the cake represents Jesus. I think it's Jesus' birthday cake. David: so if the cake represents Jesus, maybe the cake being cut represents Jesus dying, as well as Jesus being born. AJ: when we learned about Christianity at my last school, a vicar came to talk to us about Holy Communion. She said Christians eat bread and drink wine to remind them of Jesus' body and blood. Maybe that's why there's food and drink in this painting. Emily: I like how the window is open and the wind's blowing in. It reminds me of a new start, like when my baby cousin was born. My mum and her sister had fallen out, but when the baby was born, everyone made up again. Maybe the painting is saying Jesus being born was a new start for the world. These conversations encourage students to consider questions such as, do you agree with the way in which Turner has interpreted the narrative, and why or why not? Students can also begin to form interpretations of their own, as well as to develop the skills needed to engage in respectful dialogue with the views of others. In this second phase, students go beyond the initial encounter of the first phase and begin to interpret the narrative they have encountered. By listening to Turner and looking at his paintings, they are presented not only with an example of a narrative self, that of Turner, but also of how that self can be positioned in relation to a text, resulting in the creation of an interpretation, a painting. In offering their own responses to Turner's visual interpretation, students also begin to situate their own narrative selves in relation to the texts. Our third phase of learning introduces students to the significance of the biblical texts for other members of the Christian community. Different Christian denominations understand the texts in different ways, and Christian theologians over time have read the narratives in differing ways. Here, students are presented with a variety of interpretations and prompted to ask, how is the biblical narrative being understood? And why is it being understood in this way? For example, when thinking about the nativity narrative, the following Christian viewpoints might be discussed. Like most Christians, I believe that Jesus is the Son of God. God loved the world so much that God gave us Jesus to forgive people their sins. Like many Christians, I believe the nativity narrative tells me a part of the Bible's overarching story of God's creation and redemption of humankind. Like many Christians, I live my life within the narrative of the Nativity. I know that Jesus was born to save everyone, including me. When I read the narrative, I am reminded that I am loved by God. I am a Christian, and for me, the Nativity narrative isn't just about an event that happened a long time ago. It's relevant to how I live my life today. Students might also consider viewpoints from people who do not necessarily stand within the Christian tradition. For example, Jesus' birth is a happy event. That's why we celebrate at Christmas. Jesus' birth also reminds us of the events that were to occur later in his life, such as the crucifixion. Jesus was born into poverty as a marginalised figure. He reminds us that important people are not always rich and powerful. I don't believe that Jesus is the Son of God, but I do think that he was an important prophet and one of the most influential people ever to have lived. Thinking about how Christians have interpreted the texts in the light of their own specific backgrounds and contexts makes it clear for students that Christian ethics is essentially about the development of character through the reading of biblical texts in community. It shows how Christian ethics must make sense in everyday life and cannot be reduced to impossible to solve abstract dilemmas or rational principles. Students can also have the chance to discuss ethical difficulties presented by certain biblical texts, such as the story of David and Goliath, which appears to condone the use of violence. This phase enables students to use skills of empathy, imagination, and critical engagement to consider the significance of biblical narratives for Christians and others from the perspectives of these different traditions, even though they themselves are not part of these traditions. This process, which may involve a temporary and explicit suspension of disbelief on the part of students, asks that they try to walk in another's shoes and to view the world from another's perspective. Viewing the Christian faith from the inside invites students to glimpse something of what it means to live as part of a community that adopts a particular worldview and that is shaped by a certain set of narratives. Finally, our fourth phase of learning allows students to reflect upon their own understanding of the biblical narratives. Students are asked to think about whether they would portray the text in a way similar to or different from that of Turner, and to give reasons for their interpretations. They may be given the opportunity to create paintings of their own that express their understanding, or to convey their ideas using drama, photography, creative writing, or other media. Turner's paintings therefore not only open up conversation about how Christians read and understand the Bible, but also permit students to respond to biblical texts with critical and imaginative insights of their own. Also in this fourth phase, students are challenged to reflect upon those narratives that shape and inform their own character and ethics. Here, students are encouraged to consider how certain ideas, beliefs, people, and experiences have helped to make them the people they are now, in the same way that Christians are shaped by the influence of the biblical narratives and by the Christian community. They are also invited to consider how their own life stories influence their understanding of the biblical narrative, in the same way that Brian J. Turner's life story influenced his Bible paintings. In this phase, then, pupils are enabled to think about the narrative philosophy that forms their own unique sense of themselves, and are given the opportunity to consider the nature of the relationship between that narrative sense of self and the narratives of the Christian tradition, whether they consider themselves to be a part of or to stand outside this particular faith.
The piercing. Over the past 2,000 years, there have been many crucifixion paintings, most, if not all, focusing on the suffering of Jesus' crucifixion and death. In this painting, I wanted to shift the focus to his resurrection. That is why the figure of Jesus is transparent. He is there, but not really there. He died, but he didn't really die. Is the soldier piercing a body that isn't really there? My answer to this is that I wanted to show the moment between crucifixion and resurrection, between his death and when he came back to life. Online and within the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, there are separate galleries portraying the crucifixion, and as the way I engage with the biblical narrative changes as I change, there is not one painting I have produced that to me clearly defines the way I see the crucifixion. That said, this gives me the opportunity to revisit the text through the four Gospels and reinterpret them. It is an ongoing, never-ending and thoroughly engaging process.
The art of Bible reading, a narrative approach, seeks to provide a novel way of teaching Bible stories in religious education. It employs visual art as a stimulus for thinking about how biblical narratives are read and interpreted in differing ways. To implement the approach, we promote 4 phases of learning: encountering narrative, interpreting narrative, understanding narrative in community contexts, and reflecting on narratives of self and others. Using the paintings of Brian J. Turner, the art of Bible reading emphasizes the role of story within the Bible. It opens up to students the concept of interpretation, showing the Bible to be a living text, shaped by ongoing processes of reading and interpretation within and outside of Christian communities. It encourages students to think about the ways in which Christian communities have been and continue to be shaped by their telling of biblical stories and the Bible's story as a whole. And it invites students to reflect upon how they themselves, whether Christian or not, understand and relate to biblical narratives. But the art of Bible reading is just one application of our wider-ranging narrative approach to religious education. Drawing upon state-of-the-art theories and related theologies, we promote a narrative understanding of faith communities, formed from the multiple, overlapping, and at times contradictory and problematic stories of their members. By recognizing the interconnections between beliefs, identities, texts, contexts, traditions, and ethical actions within the ongoing narratives of individuals and communities, our approach seeks to do justice to the way members of faith traditions experience their faith day by day. Thus, in conclusion, we commend our narrative approach to you and hope you'll be able to apply some or all of our theories and practices in your own religious education classrooms. We would be very pleased to hear from those who do.
Jesus, John and the Turners. Within my Bible Project website, there is a contemporary gallery for paintings that deal with Jesus in the everyday, where I can portray events that are not only current and of the now, but can be personal as well. Jesus, John and the Turners appears in this section. This painting is about an actual event in my life and concerns trying to arrange our daughter's christening. Our vicar had come to my studio to discuss possible dates and times, but his diary was full and suitable dates were becoming hard to find. During our conversation, he swung round on his chair, pointed at me and said, "There's a painting in this, you know." To which I replied, "Yes, there is, and it will be called Jesus, John and the Turners." Soon after this visit, I set about producing the painting. It shows a conversation between myself, my wife and our vicar. We are sitting in the living room of our house, and also present the figure of Jesus, who is shown calming me down as the discussion is becoming quite heated. My Bible project began after a critically acclaimed tour of 33 biblical narrative paintings came to an end, having been exhibited at 7 English cathedrals between 2004 and 2005. I was at a loss as to what I could do next, and my wife, tired of my constant worrying, said, "Why don't you paint the entire Bible?" The meaning of a painting is not locked inside it like a secret code. It is made when it is encountered, interpreted and reflected upon. You could say the same about the Bible itself. And for this reason, I was delighted to work on the Art of Bible Reading project, seeking to provide opportunities for present and future generations to encounter the Bible's narrative through my paintings.